article, which turned out to be quite an intense article, I think. So I'm looking forward to the discussion about it. So the article is Unbecoming Claims, Pedagogies of Refusal in Qualitative Research, by Eve Tuck and K. Wayne Yang. So I came across this article through a post on the Thesis Whisperers website, which the blog post was up and then it seems to have been taken down or disappeared. But this is where I found the article. So she was talking a lot about saying no in academia in general. But this article, I think, is more focused towards research in particular, but really, really interesting. And the Thesis Whisperer's always got a lot to say on things. So interesting person to follow anyway, Ingrid Mubar. So they start the article with 2 quotes, which I think are quite crucial to kind of get our heads around. So the first one is that the fundamental thesis of the anthropologist is that people are objects for observation. People are then considered objects for experimentation, for manipulation, and for eventual extinction. The anthropologist thus furnishes the justification for treating Indian people like so many chessmen available for anyone to play with. So I don't think it's general or specific to Indian people, but I think in general to minorities or that people are often objects of observation. And the second one, to act on the desire to be the opposite, the desire not to collaborate is to object. And that's really the big premise of their paper is around this notion of objecting and not just going with the status quo. Yeah, so 2 powerful quotes. And I think also important to understand that the 2 authors writing this paper are themselves from minority groups. So they're writing from a perspective of being in that position and really understanding some of these issues very thoroughly. So just to introduce our discussion today, they talk about this notion of social science coding. So analyzing data, looking for codes, putting things into nice, neat boxes, has become a very mechanical process, very quantitative, and often masks or just, I think, ignores, arguably, power relationships. And so they talk about it very much in terms of what they call settler colonial knowledge production. But I think we can extrapolate the lessons from this paper beyond just settlers and colonialism and this concept of inquiry as invasion. So some of the terminology I thought was a bit extreme, but I think it actually does make one think and offers food for thought about how we view ourselves as researchers in relation to research participants.
Back to the question, like, what is the point of the research? Like, what are you going to do in the research?
Yeah, absolutely. And what is your agenda and objective? Yeah. Yeah. And what are you seeking to do with it? Yeah. I think also the recognition that some communities are over-coded, hyper-surveilled, made invisible by social science research. And certainly I was thinking about some of the work that's been done even with some of our brain-injured adults in speech pathology, where they just, I remember Claire talking about them just getting their brains nuked all the time with these constant fMRI studies and constant brain imaging of the same people. So it's not necessarily just about stories that are being collected, but other information or data that's being collected. So that they're overstudied, but not benefiting necessarily from the research. And that we have a proliferation of what they call damage-centered studies, rescue research, and pain tourism. So those were new terms to me, but certainly I think terms that we can understand and resonate with. So moving into this discussion around the concept of refusal, they talk about it as something that should be part of our analytic practice. So they start by framing this problem as related to ethics And that's why I've actually labeled this journal club as an ethics one, because this is really about ethics. So the current ways of doing ethics, the ways that IRBs and ethics committees look at ethics, doesn't necessarily match the reality and can't necessarily ensure that our social science research is ethical, meaningful, and useful to communities. And so often, and
Can you still hear us? We lost you, Jenny. You're muted at the moment.
okay, sorry, the internet kicked me off completely, but we are back. Sorry about that. Carry on.
But yeah, like when I was sitting with a kid, it seemed to matter to the child that someone was giving them concentrated attention for an hour or between an hour and 2 hours. That's what actually impacted the child, was that someone was sitting with them, doing activities with them in this like concentrated, attentive way. And that seemed to have that felt more beneficial than all the data and whatever I wrote and my thesis and what I published was like sitting with those kids. And that's why I like qualitative, is because it feels like there is an opportunity sometimes to connect with a person in a way that's actually meaningful. And often at the end of interviews, people will say to me, "Oh, it was really nice to talk about that. I've never spoken about it before," or like, "I've never thought about those things and it was helpful to talk about." And that feels like it's directly beneficial. But it's hard to explain that to somebody as like, this is the benefit of this.
Or to know if it's going to benefit them,
Exactly.
because for some people it is a benefit, and for others it can be a trigger or whatever.
Yes.
Isn't it Thoreau who said the single greatest human need is to be appreciated? Maybe if you're researching, you're showing an appreciation for their story or for their lived experience.
And just witnessing.
Yeah.
But I think that that's maybe this is why refusal is important, is because I've also had people say to me when I'm they're like, "Oh yeah, I'll do an interview," and then I'm explaining the purpose, and suddenly they're like, "Actually, I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
I actually don't want to talk about this."
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly, that's when it's not going to benefit them. I think that they know, we have to trust that they know when it's not the right time.
Yeah.
So I think what's important as well in this article is they go on about this notion of, is it sufficient just to be saying, "Oh, I'm showing the voice of this person and I'm highlighting their voice," and is that enough, A, and actually B, is that something that is beneficial to them or is it harmful to them? So they talk about that people kind of focus on the stories of pain and humiliation as, you know, those are the sexy stories. Those are the ones that we're looking for, because they're seen as authentic and compelling. And then what are we actually doing to the participants by taking those stories and sharing them? Yeah, so this was really challenging, this article. So they take it further by saying, how can we negotiate social science research so that we learn from people's experiences without serving up pain stories on a silver platter, is their wording, and kind of reveling in the pain and the anguish of the story. Absolutely, yeah. And they talk about the settler colonial gaze that hungers for these stories. So the You magazine perspective is something that, you know, humans, we like that. We enjoy reveling in that kind of voyeuristic. Yeah. Yes.
Like that whole thinking of that ethics talk, was it last year?
Yes.
Where they like spoke about all of this in terms of there was a lot of progress in terms of the research and what we learned, but at the cost of very vulnerable people.
And some pretty awful practices that were happening. Yeah. And things that were done in ways that were very disrespectful and dishonoring to communities and families and individuals.
Been this amazing research, but
The benefits outweighed.
yeah, you reflect on it sort of years later, and you realize that it was actually this. Yeah, there were a lot of questionable practices and ways things were done.
Who's defining the benefit?
Yeah.
Like, I think we go in and we say, you know, like, I mean, there's, you know, people who Carl and I have been speaking to about taking the memory box workshop for perinatal loss, and starting it at Barra. But what they want to do, which I have some ethical concerns about, is like combine it with health education at the same time and research at the same time. So the participants come for like a memory box workshop essentially to process their grief, and then they get told about the causes of stillbirth, and then they also get included in like a research activity where they're providing feedback on an aspect of this. And you know, if you're coming for the one thing and then you're being given these other things, like when do you get the opportunity to say, no, that's not really what I want? That's my ethical concern. But I think what's also happening is that the researchers are defining what is the benefit for the participant from the beginning. Like they're saying, oh, well, it would benefit you if you know the causes of stillbirth. But they, you know, when someone's in that space, they don't necessarily actually want to hear that information. Like when they're like, actually, I'm grieving about the loss of my baby. I don't want to hear that I should have come to the clinic earlier, or I could have come to the clinic earlier and then seen this and this and this thing. You know,
because it's almost like putting it's
like
feeling guilt. Yeah,
it can. Like some people do want to know, but I think that's, you know, where they're choosing that. They're choosing, I want to know so I can do something differently next time. And as medical people, we go, oh, well, if people knew, then they would have better outcomes in future. We're defining the benefit, right? Like as an outsider, we're defining what the benefit is for the person.
And the timing of that as well, you know, they might be grieving. You're not in a space to take on it.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm thinking,
Yes.
no, sorry, go for it.
No,
Yeah.
please.
I was thinking of your lovely example of, you know, with those parents say, no, they're not going to have any more children. And then the counselor's response is, well, I'm just going to give you all this information anyway.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of that, like, exactly. It kind of feels like the researchers or the healthcare professionals are like, well, I did my job. Like, I feel good about myself because I've been passed on info and I no longer have responsibility.
Yes.
It's up to you what you make with that information. But like the timing of it, it's really not going to be beneficial.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was also thinking of our example that we wrote about with the rural prac, where our department, somebody decided that what that rural community needed was a library. And so there was a lot of scurrying around collecting books.
like massive
amounts of
They were
books.
advertised on 5FM and like
No, they went way out. Yeah, so we had books galore, anyway, they started setting up this library in the community, and then there was such a drama because the community started fighting about who had ownership, who was going to run it. And it wasn't what they wanted.
But they actually said they needed a community hall for teenagers to go after school because there was such a high incidence of rape, and they wanted swimming lessons because the kids were drowning in the river.
That's what they wanted.
They didn't want a library.
Yes.
Yeah.
So exactly
And they
that
were probably
point.
really culturally and contextually irrelevant books, I'm sure.
Probably, yeah. So that question of benefit and who decides benefit, I think, is really important here. So what they go on to talk about is this idea of refusal in your analysis. So an act of resistance to trading in pain and humiliation, which I think is tricky when sometimes our research does focus on moments where people are in a point of pain, uncertainty, but it's about how one tackles that.
Yes, but that's, I think, the positive. I think for me, it's like, what's challenging and how are you working through it? Like that's the empowering part. It's like, how are you dealing with this? Because people are dealing with difficult things. And if we just say, oh, it's so terrible, I think that is disempowering. But when we say, okay, this person is seeing this avenue and they're solving their problem in this way, that's much more empowering. And it also helps other people. Like it shows other people what other avenues there are for them to help themselves in those similar situations.
Absolutely. So what they do is they go on to talk about what refusal might look like. So the first point is resistance to making someone or something the subject of the research. So, and I know this is something I've started pointing out even in some of the ethics applications that I review. So don't use language like subject, because that immediately is putting a very different spin on how you perceive yourself in relation to participants. But yeah, this concept of making someone the subject of research, help researchers avoid building their careers upon the pain of others. So I guess yeah, that's pretty harsh. Well, I'm going to go and talk a bit later about Megan's research because I think it gives a very important example here as well. But I guess it's about, yeah, thinking carefully.
I'm wishing you were rather online.
Yeah, but we need to think carefully about how do we do this research, and then how do we do it? A lot of us are researching pain. I mean, if you think of palliative care, that's very painful.
Yeah, it is. But
also, we can't avoid pain.
Like, no, you can't.
Then somebody has to help it. So,
but I'm thinking about, and I won't name her, but we've got an undergrad student at the moment who's looking at experiences of unrepaired cleft palate, and she's had so much resistance and sometimes, like a mother says, okay, I'll participate, I'll be in the interview, and then either doesn't, like it isn't online for when the interview is set up, or then comes back and says my family isn't happy about me talking about these decisions or how we got to this decision. So so
that's a result in itself.
well, that's what I said to her. So I think she's got 2 participants.
So is it asking parents or caregivers experiences of or have they decided actively not to repair the cleft?
So I'm not entirely sure. I'm not the supervisor, but she came to me because it was with an ethical question and saying, she hasn't got enough participants. But I think it's mainly children, but children who have not yet had a repair, or so I don't know if some of them are in the waiting period, or some of them have chosen not to, or
sure.
But it's good. But it's good that people feel empowered enough to say no, because a lot of it's how they go.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Carl and Shemaine both.
Yes, Carl. Do you want to jump in here, Carl?
Oh, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. I was just thinking about grappling a lot at the moment with kind of the philosophical position that we in, and looking at people as objects, or as opposed to looking at people as part of ourselves, or like as connected with each other. And I think if the research is written from a point of view that like one is suffering together, I think it changes like that sense of using the subject, like in a sense. So I think one should maybe think about it also, like, am I writing this in a way that I would be happy with it if it was me, like my pain, because it is my pain in a way. And I don't think we want to really face that often, or certainly in the kind of way people are educated in the medical field. Like, we're not educated to consider ourselves part of our patients. But I think that might help to avoid this kind of thing. Just a thought.
Thanks for that point, Carl. I think that's really a beautiful way of putting it. And I guess it's all about perspective and how does one see oneself in relation to the topic and the participants. And I guess then one can venture into different approaches to doing the research in the first place. So things like co-analysis or co-design with participants, so that it's done in a way that is honoring and sensitive to the collective pain. So thanks for that. Charmaine, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just thinking about the research into pain in our situation in palliative care, and I think it does require us to reflect on our intentions, because I just think sometimes we'll look at transcripts and say, well, this doesn't really say anything, or this person says they're coping, and we're kind of looking for issues and we're looking for problems that they may be facing because we want to solve them. I think that's the one thing. And the other is maybe by them not going deeper into their their experiences and just sort of keeping it fairly superficial and we're all okay and we're coping, maybe that's in a way a refusal, because maybe they don't want to open up their can of worms as well.
Yeah, those are important points to consider. Yeah, so I guess everything seems to come back to this need for reflexivity and really constantly interrogating and negotiating this concept of positionality and who are we in relation to the research and the participants, and how do we make this work. Yeah.
I want to say, even with the palliative stuff, I mean, like what I was saying before about, for me, is with the caregiver study, for example, the caregivers will also like tell you what is helping them. They'll tell you, oh no, I don't struggle with that so much because I do A, B, and C, or because I have this kind of support. And that's information as well, to say like, these are the things that can be supportive structures for people. It's not just a story of pain, it's a story of how does this person work past the pain. And then you'll see that, for me, I think I'm seeing differences between different people who have access to different resources. Some people have quite a lot of community around them. I'm thinking of this one man who's like, he's got his church community and like he's involved with hospice and whatever. And because of that, he has quite a lot of resources to help him. And you could look at his story and you could say, oh, wow, like it's so hard. Like he's got his eldest daughter's dying of breast cancer and his youngest daughter's, CP and been in a medical bed at home for 35 years, and what so difficult. But he is actually coping. And he's coping because of these things that he mentions, and he tells you in the interview, these things are helpful. And I think that's important information when we're talking about pain.
So I think it does come back to that, what Charmaine was saying about the intention behind what are we really doing here and what are we trying to do? Are we trying to solve people's problems or are we trying to do something different?
Rescue research, because I think we assume that there's a problem and that's there to fix it.
Yeah.
And it's not, I think, like you say, if you turn it around, it's not necessarily that people need rescuing or fixing.
Yeah.
It's that, research isn't about that. It's about understanding and kind of, I suppose also in these tragic, what we assume are these tragic situations or contexts, there can be a lot of hope and a lot of sort of positive learning as well.
Exactly.
So it's hard framed.
Yeah.
And what they talk about is that refusal comes before, after, and beyond the analytic process. So for me, that really mirrors what we've been talking about over many journal clubs, of the need to reflect right from the start of a project and right through the project. Yeah. So they also talk about this concept of inquiry as invasion. So coding and looking for codes and themes is about managing and arranging things in an order that's meaningful to us as researchers. But then there is a danger of codes becoming objects, and that we treat them objectively. So, and I think there's also this danger of publish or perish. So we have to publish, we have to be producing, we have to be doing research. And then it becomes research for the sake of research rather than engaging in slow, meaningful, quality research. So it's just something, anything, and then we look for something new, we look for the sexy topics, instead of actually trying to really do this in a meaningful way. So it's also the way that it's done, rather than, are we just doing this to expand knowledge and to better our own careers, or is this actually something that we're doing in a sensitive, meaningful way? So they also talk about the code beneath the code. So this concept of this list of questions. So who gets to know, who gets known, where is knowledge kept and kept legitimated, what knowledge is desirable, who profits, who loses, pays, gives something away, who's coerced, empowered, appointed to give away knowledge. Yeah, so some powerful questions here.
I think it's relevant here, but I mean, we've spoken about this, but recently I had a participant ask me if they could have the recording of our interview. And I was like, I think that they absolutely have a right to it, but I had to make clear to them that, like, I can't enforce confidentiality if I can't ensure that nobody else hears this, or like I can't follow the guidelines of it gets destroyed after 5 years and nobody else hears it and it's locked in a laptop. Like, that becomes your responsibility. But like, I feel like, of course, they have a right to have the recording and hear it and listen to it, and even to listen to it and then to get back to me and say, actually, I don't want you to use this as data, if that were to happen. But it was like I'd never been asked that before. And it was like,
What did you end up?
I sent it to her.
We had a discussion. I said, I don't think there's any objection to that, certainly from a procedural ethics point of view.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But I mean, there is a concern in some ways, I guess, if she's kind of sending that out to people, but I don't think she would want to, and it didn't sound like she wanted to.
It's not of someone else, it's of her.
She was talking about clinic processes, so potentially referring to other people. Yeah. So that,
I mean, there's also an element of like having to trust this other person and say, like, you're going, and and I said all of these things to her. I said, I can't ensure that it's confidential if I give it to you. Like, that becomes also your responsibility. I can't make sure that it's destroyed after 5. Like, I can't do all of that. But yeah, like, ultimately it's as much hers as it is mine. Like, if we sit and we create an interview recording together, like, And
if you take the perspective of last month's journal club, where we were talking about this concept of almost co-constructing one's reflections and talking about your experience. It's not just something that's there in your brain to access. It's actually something that you're constructing during the interview. So yes, it's all about how do you see the participant in this, and how do you how do you approach the research? What are you trying to do? What's your intention? What do you think you're getting out of this, I guess, is the big point here. So if one's wanting to churn out lots of papers and further one's career, then that's not going to sit well with this kind of idea of refusal. And so I guess part of it is also about refusing to do research in that kind of way, and saying, I'm going to do research differently, even if it's slower, even if it means that it takes longer to get papers out. It is.
Especially if you're an undergrad. So you're doing this for degree purposes. And
you
only have X amount of time to do the study. Your funders are putting pressure on you.
Well, even like as a postdoc, like, I feel like I have to show, like, I've done this much, research work, and I've published this much stuff, and then that'll get me more funding.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Collaborators, if you're part of like several people in the study, sort of saying, no, I don't agree with this, and I think it should be slower, or there's like more thought to this. And
exactly. And I mean, that can be hard, especially in big teams. And I've had some of those experiences where yeah, people have different ideas about how research should be done, about how quickly we should be writing papers.
Perhaps these big TV studies, the big clinical trials, where they sort of just add on that qualitative.
Yeah, like a little extra.
Just a little short.
And that is actually the meaty substance of what we're doing here. Yeah, sure. So they talk about 3 axioms. The first is this concept of voice and what they call the commodified pain narrative. So I don't need to hear your voice, just tell me your story, tell me your pain. You know, I'm not really interested in who you are as a person. I just want the story. And that's what we need to try and avoid. So I guess even though we're saying we're trying to highlight voices, or we're giving people an opportunity to share their story, there's still more work that needs to be done around, well, what are we actually doing here and how are we doing it?
It's really hard because, like, I know for myself, like, it becomes hard to, you know, when you're analyzing data, in some ways you're like selecting a subset of what's been shared, and you're saying these are the important points, right? Out of like like the snapshot of a human, and then you're taking, okay, these are the important bits. Like, there's this whole person that gets left behind.
Yes.
And you, like, I mean, otherwise what you end up doing is just having the whole transcript, you know, like the
Which
whole,
we can't do.
exactly.
Yeah. So it's this almost this tension between what the format of a journal article and a publication and an editor and a reviewer are looking for versus actually how do we honor this person's story, and how do we know that what we're picking out is important is actually important to that person. So I guess that's where the notion of co-design or participatory action research, that you're doing it with communities rather than on communities.
But it's also, I'm
good
thinking
idea.
about the difference between like a caregiver needs study versus the staff support needs study. And with the caregiver needs study, it's very difficult to make contact with those caregivers again. Like, even sometimes to get the interview in the first place is like logistically like difficult to organize. And whereas with the staff support needs, like, you know, I see those people quite frequently. I could like ask them again, like sit down with them and say, okay, well, I wrote this, what do you think about it? Whereas with the caregivers, that's much less possible, much less feasible. So, like, logistically, it becomes difficult. There's different extents to which you can include the community in the writing, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's something that you would need to really interrogate at the planning stage as to what is feasible and how can one do this. But I think there are still things that one can build in. So things like this opportunity where somebody comes and says, can I have my recording? You know, that they're then part of it rather than, no, well, I've got your story. Goodbye.
Yes.
Yeah. Charmaine, I see your hands up.
Yeah, just a reflection, really, just on what Siobhan was saying. Like, you know, I've written this, is it correct? And I mean, this is not a criticism because I do it myself, is just reflecting and thinking, should we actually be doing that if, you know, we are wanting to include the participant's voice, or should we be saying to them, as you say, almost more participate, saying, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm writing. Do you have any, so almost getting their input, especially in terms of the staff, you know, as you're doing the analysis, checking back, is this correct, is this correct, rather than writing it. As I say, it's something new to me that's just occurred to me, and then saying, have I got this right, you know, and in that way maybe getting there, you know, because they might just say, well, yes or no. I mean, it's a finished product, it's hard to say no at that point. So I was just wondering, in participation, even including some of our participants in that process, the analytical process before, and then it becomes more of a co-creation, and including their voice. Something I need to think about.
Yeah, and it's not always logistically easier. You know, I agree with you, Siobhan, that one does have to really think outside the box about what's going to work. I've also had examples of and experiences of projects where there have been very careful member checking opportunities built in, and then when the student has gone back to the participants to do the member checking, then the response is, no, I'm not interested. Like, you've got my story, off you go. But I guess maybe it's about offering that opportunity routinely, whether they take it up or not. That one's still thought about ways of including them there. Yeah, so thanks for those points, Charmaine.
And I think also, like we've spoken about in some of those qualitative research meetings about not only co-design but co-analysis as well. So letting the participants be part of that process of analysis. So it's not us identifying the themes and the codes and whatever, they are part of that as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
Which again, they might also be like, oh, I don't want to do this. This is a lot of work. Like, my job.
Yeah, but I guess maybe the point is about offering the opportunity. Instead of just assuming that they don't want to be part, or that they don't have a right to be part of that. That's the researcher's domain. Yeah. So the second axiom. Yes.
Sorry.
Did you want to come in here, Charmaine?
Just a brief thing. I mean, I agree. It's sometimes it is very difficult to get, to contact the participants afterwards, and maybe they aren't interested. But as you say, maybe it's offering the opportunity, and maybe even at that point gauging, how involved would you want to be if you're interested? At what point do we come back to you? So that at least, as you say, you've offered that, and they may choose not to, or may want to be very involved.
Yeah. I guess the same also, I'm just thinking of Megan's study with consent, where we recommended that you actually sometimes maybe need to go back and redo consent afterwards, especially if it's tricky data that has pain in topic.
Feel comfortable being part of the study.
Yeah.
Then again,
hold your breath. Well, that is the risk.
Comes back to again that sort of in itself is an ethical issue, in that if you do that, you have the opportunity. People have the opportunity to decline and actually student diplomat find enough participants. Stuck because she doesn't. That's what you were saying, Joe. With your student that you mentioned, that again, if it's for degree purposes, there's that pressure then that you do invite participants back, then they've got the opportunity to decline, which is completely their right, and they should have access to that information and those recordings if they want.
Absolutely. But yeah, that tension between, well, I actually need the data because it is about my career, versus, again, it comes back to the motivation. What are we really doing here and why? Yeah. So I guess it's at certain stages of your career, perhaps you can orient more strongly towards a stance of refusal, or a stance of allowing people opportunities to decline. And that's tricky, because how do we want to teach it in students from early on, and teach that it's okay actually to have people saying no. That's a result in itself. But
I feel like I
tricky.
wasn't taught that at all in undergrad science. Like that just was never a thing that ever came up, that people might say, no, I don't want to participate. Like ethics in general, I think was there wasn't enough education on it.
But then I think also your criteria for careers has to change. Because if you say that this is okay in research, then it has to be okay, or okay in how you conduct it. It also has to be what you're prepared to read, and what is accepted into journals, and what is accepted as a degree. So, it's all very well putting the pressure on the researcher, but further up the chain, it also has to change that whole ethical consideration of how important the participant is.
Absolutely.
And that's always been, my bias in any kind of interaction I've had in a teaching or research role. So
it's such a valid point, Rona, because absolutely, you can change your own stance and your own perspective. But
you can be punished.
You can be punished, yes. And the editors are looking for the sexy topics, and so the whole way that science is organized is towards topics that people are going to read, what's going to sell, what's going to get you the funding. And so in a way you've got to be playing the game But at the same time, here, I think what they're presenting is an opportunity to really reflect on who am I as a researcher and an academic, and what do I want to stand for, and how do I want to do research? And there's an opportunity then to refuse that system, hard as it is, because it means that you're not necessarily going to climb the ladder because you don't have all your papers published, or, yeah, tricky. So the second axiom here was an interesting one to me, that sometimes there are stories and experiences that already have their own place. And so taking them out of communities and individuals and putting them into academia is actually not respectful. And yeah, I have come across this particularly with, so there's a lovely ethics training course online that Macquarie University runs, and they talk about a lot of these issues of taking people's stories, taking songs, taking bits of culture and removing them and putting them in a museum or putting them into academia, because we want them there and we want to be able to look at them and say, look how exotic this is, or look how interesting this is. And actually, part of refusal is saying, well, I'm not going to do that in the first place. So, and I guess a lot of the anthropological foundations of social science come from that very sort of Victorian perspective of collecting things. You know, I remember going to the Natural History Museum and just being overwhelmed with the vastly huge display cases with dead creatures in them that Victorian people in particular had collected, because there's this human need to collect and put it somewhere where I can see it. Yeah. So the third axiom here, and this comes back to, I think, what we were saying earlier, that research may not be the intervention that's needed. So we're always trying to fix things, and maybe things don't need to be fixed. Yeah. So as researchers, when we overhear, uncover, are entrusted with narratives that we know will sell, do we stop the sale? Quite a poignant, powerful question to think about. And that does come back to what we were saying about your own career and the tensions with editors and journals and the system and ways of doing things.
You can almost see the parallels with media. You know, are we journalists or are we researchers? Do we need the headline?
Yeah.
Or do we? Yeah.
Yeah, and are we looking for the You magazine sensational research?
And I think in some ways we are, is what they say.
Yeah, and it's something that we need to interrogate and think about our intentions and motivations. So yeah, so they talk about refusal may be seen as undesirable and failure. And this is what we were saying, I think, with students, that yeah, you're taught that it's a failure if you haven't found participants. So there's this unlearning that has to happen. So they give this beautiful example from a film around a Chinese man wanting to buy a Tibetan Mastiff, and the old Tibetan man refuses to sell it. And the Chinese dog trader says, will you sell me your dog? And the herder says, not selling, not selling. And the dog trader says, if you don't sell him to me, someone else might steal him. So this colonial idea of, well, you know, if you don't give it up, then someone else will just come and take it. So you might as well give it to me. Yeah. Yeah, very powerful. So students need to start to see refusal as resistance to plundering and taking something that's maybe shouldn't be taken in the first place, or shouldn't be collected in terms of data.
I think this is where, like, you know, I think it was said earlier, but that people refusing to participate is also an outcome.
Yeah.
And you were talking about a very difficult genetic study, and why are so many people refusing? I think that there's you know, that can still be an outcome, that can still be written about, that can still be discussed.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, that we don't just go, oh, well, the study failed, but okay, people didn't want to participate. Maybe, like, what are the potential reasons why? I think that, you know, in the same way that in quantitative, they say, like, it's still it's also less sexy if you don't get a positive result.
But it's still a result.
It's still a result. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think as someone's comment highlights, this is really where the tricky bit lies, because there's such pressure that whatever we publish has to have a novel angle. It has to be original. It has to be, and this is part of the machinery that is publishing in academia and knowledge production. But we need to move students away from that. So practicing refusal and studying to object, quite interesting terms that they use. So we really need to be kind of moving away from this claiming things in data, and now it's mine, and it's my knowledge, and I own it, to really thinking again about the lived lives of real people, and what are we really doing here. So we need to object to the process of objectification or subjection, teach an ethic of studying to object. So actually teach students from the start how to do research in a way that is refusing to just gather everything novel and claim it as mine.
I'm just thinking of ownership as well in terms of
Yeah.
journals. Like you have to pay a subscription to be able to access that knowledge and access, if people publish research, but it's privilege as to who
has access
to that knowledge now.
Absolutely, yeah. So the whole machinery of the system is very, very flawed. It takes courage, I think, to work around it and to take this kind of stance of refusal and to say, I'm going to do things differently. Yeah. So really about interrogating power and privilege, and thinking about how this kind of concept of settler colonialism has actually invaded everything that we do. So the mechanisms and the machinery of the system are set up from a colonial way of doing things, of going in, taking and creating knowledge and then claiming it as mine. Yeah. So lots to think about. They had this beautiful example here. Sonto, do you want to jump in first before I talk about the examples?
Oh, yes. I just wanted to add that it also, the paper also highlighted how we've simplified the consent process. And that it was reviewed by an ethics committee and it was approved. They also signed consent, and then and then we think that's enough, and that's okay, and then we just leave it there, thinking, I guess, forgetting all the responsibility that we have towards the communities. It also just made me think about the reflexivity process. I think you mentioned it, Jenny, that it's ongoing. It's not something that you live to the end, or you only do at the beginning, but it's when you analyze, when you write, just keep reflecting on your position as a researcher, which I think it would be nice to have a reflexivity paper for our next journal club.
That's a good idea, Sonto. No, I think that reflexivity is absolutely critical here. And again, that's also something that is not often taught. We tell students, just keep a research journal. But we don't teach them this process of reflecting and what it looks like to reflect, and the fact that you are constructing and renegotiating positions all the time, that it's not something that's fixed, this is my positionality, but it's something that changes through the research process. Absolutely. So this example was just so powerful. They talk about Ken Gonzalez-Day's Erased Lynching series. And so what he's done, this artist, has taken pictures of lynchings and taken out the victim. Lynching. So in America, a group of white people going and basically attacking a black person and killing them. And so they've taken out the victim from the pictures. So taken out, there would have been a victim hanging in a tree, probably in both of those. And then what it does is it forces you to see what is unobserved. So you start to look at who are the people observing the lynching. What are they
Very
doing?
interesting.
Because you typically, if the
that's what-
victim's there, your focus would be on the victim. Yeah.
The second one particularly so nonchalant. Suits and stuff. And
Yeah.
it's like a day out. Oh,
Yes. It's like a really non-event kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yet, if that person who'd been lynched was in that photo, that would just be so the horror of it would draw your eye to that victim as opposed to the observers. So just a reminder to really engage with what is unobserved, and I guess the silences, the things that are not said, what's not in whatever data you've collected that maybe you expected to be there. Yeah.
But I mean, and I think I've said this before, but I mean, that's the whole crux of Arthur Frank's work, is that the narrative is in what's not said, not what is said.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And I guess maybe we can extrapolate that to the results are in who's not participating or refusing to participate, not necessarily in the ones who have said yes and done an interview. Yeah, sure. So refusing thoroughly is really about leaning in to when your choice of object feels wrong. They talk a lot about teaching students to kind of trust their gut feeling on things. If it's feeling wrong, if you're having a check about it, an intuitive check, then maybe you need to interrogate that more. And
that one thing to case.
absolutely. And I'm gonna chat about that on the next slide, because I think that's really, really important to think about. Resist the urge to study people and their problems. Refuse to share sensational interview data. Yeah, and just to flip, I'm going to flip forward to, I put just a shot of Megan's paper here, because this really did happen. Do you want to share a bit about what happened with this?
Yeah, sure. It's the jog my memory bit, but it was essentially a video recording of a pregnant mom where she'd gone in for a routine checkup, and she had agreed to be part of my study, which really was just around discussing findings around risk, or sort of the offer of an amniocentesis. But what had happened is that this woman, not only had they found abnormal things on her ultrasound, but essentially these findings were so severe that she was going to be offered not an amniocentesis, but she was being offered a termination. And at the time, I wasn't aware of the severity of the findings on the ultrasound. And the woman had agreed to be part of my study, which she was going to be video recorded with a genetic counselor who was going to share this information with her. But I wasn't aware of the extent of the abnormalities and what was going to be discussed in that session. So essentially, I had this participant who had gone through this terribly traumatic event, and I had captured it all on video of her world falling apart, sort of in that 45 minutes.
It was very distressing
It was
data
very
to watch.
distressing to watch the session. The woman was very distressed, and it said the counsellor was very distressed, sort of having to impart this information. And as the researcher, not only watching it, but also now deciding, was this really going to add to my study in terms of, should we include this participant and should we include this video at all? And then also what was problematic is that I hadn't, in terms of my ethics, I hadn't included sort of a post consent. So she had consented prior to having conducted the consultation, and then I didn't have her contact details to ask her again from a post consent, would she still be willing to be part of the study, and was she still comfortable with me including this data? And so Jenny and I had a long
It's a lot of discussion.
I sat with this for months, actually trying to decide whether to include it or not. And in the end, we actually did include it, just because we felt that it was in itself a very powerful finding in terms of talking about distressing moments in research and ethically what to do about it.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was a difficult ethical moment for me in terms of the responsibility as the researcher now that I have this information about someone else and what to do with it.
Yeah, so we wrote this paper where we really grappled with what could we have done, what should we have done, and going forward, what would we do differently with this case. Yeah, and it basically did come down to a recommendation of doing consent again, and offering that person an opportunity to refuse participation.
It's quite interesting that the counsellor didn't, because I mean, they were also participants, and knowing that it was going to be such a difficult consultation, that they didn't decline participation.
Yeah.
At the,
Yeah.
I mean,
On behalf of the patient.
Yeah.
but just really the counsellor was also a participant.
Yeah,
Also, it wasn't just the mum who needed to.
No,
Mm.
yeah,
to
needed
consent.
consent.
It's quite interesting that they were happy
Yeah.
to be videoed, because I can't imagine wanting to be videoed. I mean, it's
Yeah.
fine if you're going to have a lovely, happy ending in a session and whatever, but if you go in knowing that you're going to be breaking bad news, especially this kind of, it's not like, well, there may be something and you want to go.
I think also in the nature of genetic counselling, you break bad news all the time.
Yes.
So this is routine.
It almost
Yeah.
becomes routine, and it almost, you don't become like blunted emotionally,
Yeah.
but you just
You see it as
it's your
part of-
normal,
Yeah.
and that's kind of, that's kind of there every day.
Mm.
So again,
Yeah.
it was so distressing, but for her, maybe she consented because it wasn't unusual for her to do this type of work.
Yeah.
But yeah, equity,
Yeah.
there was a lot going on.
Very tricky. Yeah, and so I quite like their conclusion here about studying power and focusing your gaze as a researcher and analyst on power in the form of institutions, policy, research itself, rather than on the sensational or the story from the individual, and the juicy bits in the story. So, I mean, I guess that experience that Megan has been describing also kind of led us to really question ways of doing more broadly. And yeah, I guess that's where the authors are suggesting we head. So they say in conclusion, where can we take the black marker and draw lines of redaction, cut and not paste, delete, insert blank spaces in lieu of text? And particularly, where is a safekeeping box for the narratives that are not ours to give away? So just like that example, what do we do with that very intense, emotional, raw data? And
Yeah, because you
what
can't
do
just delete it.
No,
Just like throw
what do
away
we do with it? Yeah.
somebody's
Yeah,
story. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
And also there is a value in dealing with hard stuff.
Absolutely.
Because this is the reality
think
that
that's
you
what
have
we ended up-
genetic
we
counselling.
ended up deciding actually to include it and to be very careful about how we presented that data, because sort of doing a lot of reflecting was that our immediate reaction is to step away from it and to exclude it and say, this is very sensitive, we can't deal with this, it's not appropriate. But in the same way, you almost marginalize those vulnerable cases even more, because we don't have a lot of data or research on those moments because they're so ethically contentious. And we almost, my sort of justification of keeping it in was that we need to learn from this experience as well, in terms of how to break bad news in those moments, and how could we possibly do it better, and what did the counsellor do well, what could she perhaps have improved on,
Yeah.
what was going on for the participant, where was the support that she may have needed, where did she feel supported in that moment. And so it was almost a learning opportunity for counselling training, in terms of, in those moments, what happens and what is good about them and what can we learn and improve on.
Yeah.
So that was my justification for keeping it in the data and presenting it, but being very careful about how I presented it, and presenting it in a very sensitive manner, and to be very to kind of emphasize the vulnerability and the fragility of that consultation, and to be respectful of that moment.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
So they kind of end off here by saying we need to make space for recognition and reciprocity, and I would add for reflection, just to put another R in there. But the reflection, I think, is absolutely key.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like also, like a lot of women who experience pregnancy loss and baby loss, I think they commonly talk about how like hidden it is and how it feels like they're the only one having this experience. And so to have that documented or to have open discussion about that's also important, so that other women know, oh, that, yes, other people have this experience. What was it like for them? It seems to be something that can be really supportive to some people to connect with those stories.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
you almost marginalize them even more because it's almost such a tricky topic that people don't want to go there and talk about.
Exactly.
It comes back to what you were saying earlier. It's about so what. You know, is it just, are you presenting this work because it's juicy or you know, sort of sensationalist You magazine?
Or what are you
Or
using
what-
it for counseling?
Yeah.
What is the purpose? Like, is it
Yeah.
rather than it just being voyeuristic, there needs to be sort of positive outcome from you, just
Benefit.
if you want to look at this stuff.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
And just that nuance, because, you know, it's an unfortunate reality that change comes from the dramatic. So we remember the sensational and then we act on it. And, you know, if poor You magazine, but, you know, sometimes it takes an article like, you know, on abuse for it to be brought into the mainstream media and people to make changes. And we've seen that happen in the church. We've seen it happen, the Me Too movement, all those kind of things. And if you look at them,
It's the flip side.
Yes.
Yeah.
you know, I mean, look, it is a little bit voyeuristic. It is maybe exposing people to further trauma through, you know, having their stories out there. But in order for things to change, sometimes that needs to happen. And I think you have to, I think maybe that was what was missing for me in this paper is also there is some benefit in exposure.
I guess it's how it's done.
Yeah.
That's really the crux. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I feel like we could talk for a whole nother hour on this. It's been such a meaty topic. I don't know if there are any final thoughts from anyone online before we sign off. But lots to think about here. Nick, go for it.
Yes, thanks. I was particularly intrigued by the call to research institutions. I think the culminating point for me was around that. And I'm just thinking about the work I'm doing on the HPV vaccine and some of my students who were researching Department of Health social media messaging, and how, in some sense, I'm framing that as kind of researching the institutional messaging. So I'm quite pleased in some sense that I am doing what this article is recommending for part of the project, at least. But it has made me think critically about how can I research power structures more so than people. So thanks for presenting the article.
Yeah, pleasure. Yeah, lots to think about here. So thanks, Nick, for those thoughts. So thanks, everyone, for joining this morning. Lots to think about, and we look forward to next month's edition of the Journal Club. I think we will take a break in July and start again in August.
So this is my last Journal Club.
Yes. So thanks and have a good day further, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye.